Insight to Issachar. The birth of Issachar marks the fifth son to be born to Leah and Jacob. He is actually the older brother of Zebulun, who I looked at last month, but Jacob addresses Issachar after his younger brother when he gives his prophetic blessing. This was unusual, as normally the patriarch would address his sons in the order in which they were born. This is possibly to do with the prophetic story being told through Jacob's words for Israel as a nation, and I'll look at what Issachar represents later on. As I mentioned in the poem, Issachar's name can be translated to mean man of hire. This refers to how Leah essentially hired her husband from her sister Rachel, who was Jacob's preferred wife. This particular night between Leah and Jacob led to the conception of Issachar, and so his name, man of hire, therefore reflects this process that Leah went through. It speaks of a person whose labour can be bought or rented, and so although this was initially in reference to Leah hiring Jacob, it could be said that it gives the impression that from the moment of his conception, Issachar was destined to a life of manual labour. There is a second possible translation of this name, which is, there is a reward. This meaning would suggest Issachar's name came from Leah's belief that her fifth son was a divine reward for previously giving her maid, Zilpah, to Jacob as his concubine. As a result, Zilpah had given birth to two more of Jacob's sons, thereby furthering the success of the family name and legacy, and so Leah viewed her own conception of a fifth son as a direct reward for doing this. Her words in verse 18 confirm this suggestion as she declares, God has given me my wages because I have given my maid to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. This brings onto the scene the concept of the handmaid system and how both Leah and Rachel gave their maids to Jacob as concubines to conceive children on their behalf. Under their cultural system, any children born to Jacob through the handmaids Zilpah and Bilhah were legally the children of Leah and Rachel. As I've mentioned a few times during these studies, multiple wives was never a part of God's plan for marriage, and this dysfunctional household certainly gives us great evidence for why this is a disastrous idea. I think it's so important for us to understand what's going on in these verses, however, and why we see God working through this situation in spite of the fact that it wasn't something he intended for marriage. The polygamous marriages we read about in Scripture were not God's plan at all. They were part of the man-made culture of the day. Furthermore, polygamy wasn't set up primarily for carnal reasons, but rather it was a system that was created as a type of insurance against the family becoming childless. A family without offspring in those days meant that they wouldn't be able to support themselves financially and would have no prospects for the future. Polygamous marriages were seen as a way to ensure greater chances of continuing on the family name, as well as preventing poverty and financial ruin. This was a practice that was developed in the culture, but outside of the will of God. And so what we see through these verses is God's grace and patience working through a man-made system. Thankfully, God did bring a stop to this practice, but not right away. The arrangement was so integral and interwoven within this culture that, had God brought it to an instant end, it would have caused a complete collapse and been too destructive for the inner structure of that society. What's clear is that God allowed the polygamous arrangement to continue for a time, but he did bring a gradual end to it through the law of Moses, which we can read about in Leviticus chapter 18. We see in these verses that God's law forbade polygamous marriage. And so going back to the text, while the arrangement between Jacob and the handmaids clearly wasn't God's plan for marriage, it was technically legal due to it being at a time prior to the law of Moses. Studying these passages of scripture and reading about the years of misery caused by this arrangement, we can certainly see why God brought an end to this practice. Multiple wives bring incredible conflict for everyone involved, and Leah's words to her sister in Genesis 30 verse 15 undoubtedly show that she feels Jacob is her husband. She makes it clear that in her mind, Jacob was not Rachel's to take, and she had stolen him from her. What a sorrowful condition to be living in, and what a damaging environment for the children to be raised in. As American theologian Donald Barnhouse once wrote on the matter, "Is it any wonder that this family had a history of bloodshed? Children reflect the atmosphere of the home." It really highlights the truth that when it comes to marriage and the complexities of human relationships, it's always best to listen to God's wisdom and adhere to His plan for us. He gives us boundaries not to spoil the fun, but for our benefit and protection.